Welcome back to the Left of Old North. We're your hosts, Adrian
and CJ.
And today we are coming to you on Memorial Day. We, at the back half of this episode, are going to have a great interview with Chris Cooper, the WCU professor and author of Anatomy of a Purple State. And I had a lot of fun with that interview.
Oh yeah, no, same. I definitely would love to have him back on here at some point.
I feel like he will come back on at some point because we had a great conversation. He hedged his bets a little bit, but he made a couple of predictions, and I want to see how those pan out at some point. You know, whether it's a year from now or 10 years from now, we got to catch up with him and see how things shake up. You know.
Yeah.
And then, you know, if he's wrong, we'll just badger him and just let him know. You know, we'll run him off like Ann Seltzer got run off in Iowa.
That when that poll came out,
yeah, +3 in Iowa.
Either going to be the biggest upset in history, or she is going to be ran out of town. Yeah, no,
yeah.
No.
And
moving on, because I will to that.
Yeah, and I mean he did make the disclaimer that he's not really a predictions guy, so we kind of nudged him into it. But you know, overall, great interview. We had a lot of great conversation, and he had a lot of good advice for both people who are in politics and people who study it and want to know more. And you can definitely get a really good overview. It's a great primer. The book's called Anatomy of a Purple State. It came out just last year, right before the election, actually. So we talk a little bit about that. So go make sure and watch the episode where we get to interview him. This episode, excuse me. I'm also thinking about the fact that this is 1 week where we've actually released 2 full-length episodes. So we released an episode last Friday, and because there was just too much to talk about. There was way too much that happened this week to talk about.
We had to give the people what they wanted, and by give the people what they wanted, I mean just kind of rants for a little bit about what was going on.
Well, it wasn't too badly structured, I don't think. I think we only had to skip over one section, which we'll cover a little bit more today. And, you know, if you want to know more about what's the craziness that's been going on in North Carolina this week, go and check out that bonus episode. It's titled The Eyes of the Storm. It basically just talks about how we are experiencing a lot of intermittent weather, so to speak, in the world of politics right now that is actually probably going to manifest itself in a way that we may not be able to foresee yet. But it's only getting worse right now. And we're not exactly being left with a lot of protections, both from the storm of politics and also from literal storms that may be coming our way during this next hurricane season. So strap in, folks. Make sure you're prepared. Moving on. So again, today is Memorial Day. And as you're listening to this, and maybe as you go throughout your day, all I would ask is that regardless of how you feel about the Department of Defense or what America does overseas with its military, just remember that from the beginning of this nation to the current day, a lot of good men and women have died protecting the freedoms that we now get to enjoy. And I think that we just got to make sure that we're honoring them for that. Speaking not only as somebody who served myself, I think that we owe it to a lot of people to make sure that we're remembering them today, keeping them in our thoughts. And, you know, you don't necessarily have to thank some random dude in uniform for his or her service, but I don't know. Those people believed in something along the way, regardless of how you feel about it, you know?
I do want to also kind of take a moment and extend my thanks. I do have some folks in my family who are in the military, and I've heard some of their stories and whatnot, and I know that it's very much a huge sacrifice of your time, your health, and possibly your life, depending on the various circumstances at the time. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who did serve.
Yeah.
And are currently serving.
Yeah, exactly. Pause 1 second. Yeah. And, thank me for my service. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. uh, no, I always look at that as, it's honestly, if you want my honest take on this, it is often a little bit embarrassing for people to do it in public. And I'm sure that anybody who has family members that have served would probably hear the same thing from them. But like when some random person who maybe sees you in your uniform or finds out through conversation that you served in some capacity, they go like, thank you for your service. It's always a little bit like, like I did radios. I wasn't on like, I wasn't on the front lines risking my life in the same way. So, we take it as it comes. One thing that I've always, not always, but one thing that I've responded with when it's somebody who has a good sense of humor, is I'll say in response, thank you for paying your taxes.
Jesus. I mean,
it's true though.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the military has a budget of, what was it, $997 billion, get a bit of which comes from taxes.
A bit of which, give or take, right? Yeah, it's... I've often taken Memorial Day to talk about how bloated our military budget is. Even when I was serving, this was the kind of thing that I would talk with my NCOs and fellow airmen about, because it's really something that just never seems to go down, ever. And it really raises the question of why it's nearly $1 trillion to run a military that's not even currently in wartime. Yeah. So, we've currently got so many contracts with so many different private corporations that basically just take all this money for R&D and turn around and make halfway decent jets like the F-35. And I only say that because it's like a bit of an in-joke. It took 15 years for this thing to even get off the ground, and it had so many development issues. From all accounts, it's a damn good fighter jet. So there's that. But what's going to be interesting too is I think that as we move forward with trying to recreate the left, trying to recreate the Democratic Party, I think that that's something that Democrats need to push a little bit harder on.
Yeah, as far as like kind of reassessing things and kind of holding feet to the fire on making sure all this is spent responsibly, or
trying to rein it in a little bit. Like voting, even if it's not gonna matter, I think voting against the spending bill, if it's a ridiculous amount, is a good thing to do. But that's my personal 2 cents, and I know that some Democrats would heavily disagree with me, and that's okay.
I mean, one thing that I most definitely think about whenever I see just how much the military budget is how much we're spending and then how much the next country is spending. I looked it up earlier as we were preparing for this, and we're in first place at $997 billion, and China is in second place with 300 some odd billion dollars. So a third of what we got, right?
Yeah. We
could cut our budget literally in half right there and still be ahead.
We'd still be outspending them by over $100 billion.
Yeah. And I understand that, a lot of, kind of America's influence, I guess, lies in its military might.
Yeah. A lot of our cultural identity, too, if you think about it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, most definitely. I mean, we're the only real country that has military bases in other countries, like on the scale we do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not even close.
No, I mean, and it's all strategic. It's, obviously to have places to launch operations from if need be, but it's also just our way of saying, hey, look how powerful we are. You fuck with us, we can be there at your door in like 2 seconds.
Right. And what I think is interesting too is, I mean, you bring that up, right? We talked a little bit before the show, but I think that where Democrats tend to fail in some aspect, right, is that they can't all get on the same page about whether to support military might or to try and rein it in. There are a lot of Democrats that support making sure that the military gets however much money it wants. And then there are some Democrats that really want to make sure that we're reining in on the military spending. And though he's not a Democrat, technically, but he is on the left, Bernie Sanders has fought for that forever. And I tend to agree with him in a lot of aspects about decreasing our military spending, because it really is out of hand. Not to, we're not even touching on the fact that they've failed their audit nearly every year for the past decade. So money's just going poof, and we don't know what happened to it.
And I just think, wherever that money went, what could we as a country, do with that money if it wasn't going towards DOD? We could have free school lunch for every kid. We could, honest to God, solve homelessness. We could, increase our soft power around the world.
Whoa. Slow your roll. The minute you started talking about feeding children, every Republican stopped listening.
I know, it's radical, right?
Yeah.
How dare I have basic empathy and, care about kids?
No, but who's going to pay for it, CJ?
I mean,
who's going to pay for it, CJ?
I think I would rather have my taxes go, to a hungry child than a bomb.
4 children.
Yeah.
Sad but true. Look, all I'm saying is that one of the most well-known soldiers of the modern era was literally on camera multiple times bragging about sniping children.
We need to figure out where our priorities lie. I mean, and think about what actually is helpful.
Yeah.
For the country.
Yeah.
Again, the school lunch thing, solving homelessness, taking some of this money and actually improving Veterans Affairs, improving the VA. But they're taking some of this money and, like I said a second ago, improving our soft power around the world. We don't have to always be, guns a-blazing or threatening to be able to have guns a-blazing at moment's notice. There are other ways to, spread our influence and kind of secure allies and our positioning on the world stage. And that's where it cuts to things like USAID are so bad.
See,
aside from the, massive, amount of death that comes with cutting them, there's also the element of we lose a little bit of our standing.
See, but you don't make money from those things. And you do make money from funding war. You do make money from building bombs and manufacturing guns and bullets and airplanes and tanks. So
yeah, if you're Lockheed Martin.
Yeah, that's why some of the top lobbyists in Washington, D.C. work for military armament firms and for military industrialists. They're paid very, very well to do their job.
Yeah, I mean, and this isn't to say, just, to hell with the military. We don't need one. Obviously, we do need one. We do need a strong one,
Yeah.
Because there are threats out there that we should be actively trying to,
defend against. Yeah.
What's the word? Yeah, defend against and, anticipate their moves and all that stuff. But there's also other problems that we can solve at home for a fraction of what we spend on this.
Right. And I think I agree with that wholeheartedly, especially on what you were kind of saying. We need to get on some kind of a same page, right? Because if Democrats are out there talking about how we need to have the most lethal military force in the world while they're running for office, then they kind of just sound like Republicans a lot of the time. And that's not to say that, blue good, red bad. No, blue mistaken on their base. Blue not reading the room. Because I do think that there are a lot of Democrats who want a strong military, but to say that they're the most, to say we need to have the most lethal fighting force in the world, that's kind of almost a lead into just saying we need to spend more on the military. Because that's the kind of language that Republicans have used in the past.
Oh, yeah. No, it is. Very much so.
So we may be seeing, and I think that that's what turned a lot of leftists and progressives away from like the Kamala Harris campaign because she was saying things like that. And ultimately, what people heard was, I'm going to just do exactly what we were doing before, and if they want to increase the military budget, I will sign off on that sucker, no questions asked. So we're making this CJ's not making this a big thing. I'm making this. I'm sorry for dragging him feet first into it, but this is something that I've been very passionate about, especially in the last 10 years or so. And I try to talk about it on Memorial Day, not because I'm trying to disparage soldiers, airmen, sailors, but we really need to think about how the cost of war is more than just dollars and cents, and increasing the military budget only gives us more leeway in the future to throw bodies at the problem. And people talk about, well, we have more sophisticated technology, we can use drones, we can use airstrikes and all these other things. But at the end of the day, I'm not just talking about men and women that are lost in the line of duty. I'm talking about 22 veterans per day that lose their lives to suicide, because being in the military is extremely stressful in a lot of ways, speaking personally. And when you are behind a monitor, watching a black and white screen and seeing a bomb go off and knowing that it took people's lives on the other end of it, that affects you. Not saying that happened to me or that I felt that, but this is the kind of thing we need to take into account, that a lot of these military members are still people, and the cost of war is more than just lowering the budget. Like the charge of trying to lower the military budget is more than just arguing for like fiscal responsibility. It's that let's try to steer away America's culture from being one funded directly for war, and instead, like CJ was advocating for, that's directed in funding for people, for diplomacy.
Because at the end of the day, no matter what the war is, no matter what country the war or what countries are involved in the war, all wars really end up the same way. It ends with a group of people in a room talking, which is what they should have done from the beginning.
That's a really good point. It's
I'll be honest with you.
At some point, they're going to be in.
I got that from an episode of Doctor Who.
See, and I was going to guess The West Wing.
Nah, it's a Peter Capaldi episode of Doctor Who. It's really good. Definitely watch it.
It may come from a British TV show, but it's true all the same, that the only difference between diplomacy and war is that war just racks up a lot more bodies. So, not trying to bring the mood down, just something that I really feel like needs to be said, needs to be thought about during this day of remembrance for people that died. Both, again, I was listening to a bunch of old songs from the Revolutionary War era and just thinking about how the men who fought the British, and I'm not talking about like the white Protestant slave owners that were just trying to protect their monetary interests. I'm talking about the farm boys that signed up because they felt like their rights were being taken away from them, because they were having British soldiers quartered in their homes. And if anything like that happened today, I would expect Americans to fight back against that. So we need to remember those folks, and remember that the spirit of America is, for better or worse, integrally tied to our military history, because that's how this country was born. And before we get to our interview with Chris Cooper, which is coming up here in a second, something in the last few days that just happened that kind of ties into what we were talking about with him, actually. This consolidation of power within the North Carolina General Assembly and the right wing of North Carolina politics. The Supreme Court decided on Friday, of course, literally when we released the episode, so we couldn't even bring it up. They denied Democratic Governor Josh Stein's request to block new appointments to the State Board of Elections. What does that mean, CJ? Can you layman it down for us there?
Yeah, so essentially it means that any appointments that the state auditor, who was just given this power, any appointments that he makes are allowed to stand right now while Stein's lawsuit is still going through the courts. And that is something that could take months to resolve, really.
Yeah, if not years.
And again, yeah, I want to remind everyone that this is the only state in the country where the state auditor, the state auditor has this ability. There's nothing in his job description that justifies this kind of power.
Right.
And as we've said before, if this was, uh,
Jessica
was it Jessica
Holmes.
Holmes who was
Yeah.
running? Yeah, this was Jessica Holmes, a Democrat. Would the Republicans in the General Assembly have done this? Hell no. We all know they wouldn't. They know they wouldn't. We know and they know what this is. And again, it is a blatant power grab.
Yeah.
That's it.
How much you want to bet if a Democrat wins the next state auditor election that they'll try to change it back?
Oh, uh, yeah, no, most definitely. I'll bet $100 right here, right now. Um, I like a sure thing. I like a safe bet. But on May 1st, Bolyak, the auditor, was sworn in, or was able to make these appointments, make these changes to the election board, which shifted it from a 3-2 Democratic majority to a 3-2 Republican majority. Allison Riggs, in a dissenting opinion, said, quote, "The Supreme Court majority is rewriting precedent and creating an explanation for an unexplained Court of Appeals order in an effort to upend 125 years status quo for the North Carolina State Board of Elections while this case winds its way through the courts."
Yeah.
Should also say that this ruling also allows Boyack to proceed with choosing chairpersons of the 100 county election boards beginning in late June.
Yeah. So keep that in mind, that these may seem like small changes. These may seem like changes that probably won't affect you directly, but given a long enough timeline, they absolutely will. Because these are the folks that decide whether elections get certified.
Yeah. This is how the elections are conducted, how many polling sites will be open in your area, what hours those are going to be open in the area.
And keep in mind, they're trying to make it a 6-day voting period.
Mm-hmm.
If they can get it lower, I'm sure they will. They want to make it a 6-day early voting period.
Yeah. I mean, hell, there are Republicans in the General Assembly who want to make Election Day just a one-day thing, a one and done, and that's it.
Yeah. So screw you if you can't get off on a Tuesday.
Yeah. And again, this is because, as we said before, they don't care about your ability to vote.
No.
And if voting didn't work, they wouldn't be trying to take it away.
Right. And with these 100 county board of elections too, like CJ was saying, this was something that happened in Texas not too long ago, that the governor, actually, real charmer, that one, decided that he would only allow for one early drop-off site in each county. And I may be misremembering something about that. Maybe it was only one in each precinct. But you gotta remember that some of these precincts, especially in like Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, some of these precincts have hundreds of thousands of people living in them. And maybe not hundreds, tens of thousands at the very least. And that's a lot of people to only have one drop box for. So all that to say, this is the kind of thing that Dave Bolyak could do, is create rules that specifically are designed to pull back voting rights just a little bit, just within the rules, but to stifle a voter's ability to actually go and vote.
Exactly. It's trying to stifle those rights there at the margins. The thing is, once you get to those margins, you create new margins that you can then, work in on, and then some more and more and more, and then it just closes.
Until you're one day voting, and it's only open from 10 to 6, and you have to have 3 forms of identification on you, and you can't drop off for anybody else. I'm not messing around. Like, I'm not pulling this out of my butt. This is all things that they have advocated for.
Yeah.
1 day voting periods, 10 to 6. You can't drop off anybody's ballot for them. It's all these kinds of things that, you know, we may see them as individual pushes by the Republican Party. But at the end of the day, if they were actually to implement all of those, it would be one of the most restrictive voting practices in the world.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, we got to remember the Republican policies may be awful and they may be, you know, stupid. The Republican Party, when it comes to strategy, is not necessarily dumb.
No. There's a reason for
they
all
have
this.
a plan. They know what they're doing.
There's a reason they want to consolidate power in the NCGA. And that is because the General Assembly is what decides the district lines every 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's state law. And who decided it was state law? I'll give you one guess. And who decided that it didn't have to be nonpartisan? I'll give you one guess again. I'm sure you'll get this one right too. And they want to make the governor powerless. They want to make the judicial branch just a rubber stamp for pretty much anything the General Assembly wants to do. And if you really look at like a macro level, this is essentially what the Trump administration is trying to do, but with the executive branch. Project 2025 is specifically geared towards making sure that the executive branch is clothed in power that should belong to the judicial and the legislative branch. But instead, what they're trying to do, even with their slim majority in the House, is they're trying to basically just do whatever President Trump wants to do. Put forward whatever kind of legislation they know he will sign, no matter what. And instead of using the judicial branch as a check on that power, even though it's not fully there yet, we know it's not fully there yet because we've already seen them check on Trump's power a couple times. So I'm not immediately saying that they're just, shilling for Trump all the time. But we are not quite there yet. But what they want to do is to make sure that the judicial branch is instead a check on a citizen's right or the House's right to be able to petition the executive branch and say, what you're doing is wrong, and we're going to sue, or we're going to take you to court. And the Supreme Court, they want it to be there as a barrier to whatever the Trump administration wants to do. This is all in Project 2025. Again, I'm not pulling this out of my ass. We've been warning y'all for a very long time now, and it's not my fault if you didn't read it.
And here's the thing, it's not like this is something that's been a secret hidden plan. No, it's been out there in plain sight. Like, they have been open about it. They put up a 900-page document or whatever the hell it is? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
900 pages.
They've said what they want to do. And if you're listening to us and are going, oh, well, that's just bullshit, you can go to the Heritage Foundation's website and find this.
Yeah.
It's not that hard.
Yeah. But to talk a little bit more about the General Assembly and to talk a little bit more about political imbalance, or rather some balance in the state, thank you for listening to us ramble on for the last 20-something minutes. But it is time to get on to our interview with the incredible Chris Cooper, again, professor from Western Carolina University, author of Anatomy of a Purple State. We're going to introduce him now. I hope you'll stick around for the rest of the interview. Thanks for listening to us. Make sure to follow us on all the places. Do all the things. Subscribe to our Substack. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got many more interviews coming down the pipeline that I'm sure you're going to be excited about. I know we are.
Oh, yeah.
So stick around with us on the left of Old North. See you on the flip side. All right, we are here with Dr. Chris Cooper. Chris is the Madison Distinguished Professor of Political Science and Director of the Hare Institute for Public Affairs at Western Carolina University. His writing, commentary, and research have helped define how we understand North Carolina's fast-changing political landscape. And boy, does it change fast. From redistricting fights to voter behavior to the future of both parties in the state. He's also the co-author of The New Politics of North Carolina and author of the recent Anatomy of a Purple State, a must-read for anyone who's actually serious about learning the politics of the Old North State. And it's quickly becoming a Bible for politicos here. So, not to pump you up too much, but just so you know, if you've read an article about NC politics in the last 5 years, chances are he was quoted in it. So we're honored to have him on today to help us make sense of where we are, how we got here, and what is the path forward for the state as a whole. Chris, welcome to the Left of Old North.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for engaging with the state's politics. I appreciate your time.
Well, we definitely appreciate yours. And now that the 2024 election is over and done with, including the most recently decided NC Supreme Court case, or NC Supreme Court race, rather, do you wish you had waited maybe like a few more months before releasing Anatomy of a Purple State, or are you good with where it ended up?
This is just fodder for the second edition, right? No, I mean, it is wild. In all seriousness, I mean, like, this was an internal dialogue with myself and a little bit with the press too. Like, when's the right time to put out a book like this? And so we made a decision to put it out right before the 2024 election, which was great in some ways, and that people obviously were interested in politics. But it also means we're going to need to do an update pretty soon, because right after the 2024 election, obviously we have new data, we have new insights. We wrote some things in there about the way, for example, that elections are run in the state of North Carolina. And as of last week, like, we need to update that, right? It's no longer the party of the governor that gets these appointees. It's the party of the auditor. Didn't see that one coming. So we are going to need some updates for sure.
So I'm guessing there is a second edition planned at some point.
It's in my brain now. Let's see if we can get from my brain to the publisher's spreadsheet. But let's hope so.
Well, that's good to know.
I was just gonna say, it's amazing how quickly things change here. We've joked about on the podcast before. Sometimes we wish we had like waited a day to record, or like maybe 2 hours to record, because of course, as soon as we're done recording, something happens that just negates what we just did.
That's North Carolina politics, right? I mean, it is like all the cliches are true. It changes so fast. And, y'all say this, I've talked to other podcasters and they say the same thing, the stuff that I write, like I feel this way constantly. Like, you think you've got a general principle of the way things work. And then all of a sudden you're thrown for a wrench, right? You spend 6 months and 2 days, 6 months and 1 day talking about the North Carolina State Supreme Court race, for example. And you think, hey, there's this federal judge, Judge Wynn. He's a Trump appointee. He doesn't seem real friendly to the arguments likely of Allison Riggs. I bet we're going to be in this thing for a while. Then Wynn comes down, he puts down a decision that makes you question all that. He says essentially, Riggs is right, Griffin's wrong. Well, let's move forward. I didn't see that one coming, I'll be honest with you.
And same. I was going to say, I don't think anybody can blame you for that. I don't think anybody saw that coming. I was expecting it to go for at least another month, if not more.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it seemed like this really was the draw that Griffin wanted. And as far as judges, and doesn't mean he's a good judge or bad judge or anything about him. It just seemed like this is somebody who's probably, if Jefferson Griffin could choose a justice, this might be the one. And obviously it didn't go that way.
And it's interesting, especially when we're talking about the makeup of the court, which could make a huge difference. Maybe not coming down the line too soon, but at least in 2028, we have, in between that time, 4 different Supreme Court races, seats up for grab. So I wanted to ask you your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's it exactly, right? So I've seen a lot of folks say, well, why is the GOP and why is Griffin trying to work so hard for this one seat, right? I mean, what's the difference between being up, having one Democrat versus 2 Democrats? And the reason, of course, is this is a play for the next redistricting cycle, I think, in a lot of ways. So 2028 is going to be the key year. In 2026, all the Democrats can possibly do is just hold on, of course, to Anita Earl's seat if they're lucky. If they lose that seat, they might still have a Republican majority, but 2028 is going to be the key. And that's, I think, what everybody's playing for is 2028, 2030, because when we get those new maps in 2031, the court who's in place at that time is going to be the key driver of what's likely to happen.
And just a quick follow-up on that. Do you think that Democrats, like the Democratic Party of North Carolina, do you think they have another 6-month legal battle ready in their back pocket if something like Riggs happens again in 2026 with Anita Earls?
I mean, I think they're going to have to, right? I mean, there's really no choice. But, that's one of the pieces of this that some folks have covered. It's not that it's been undiscovered or something, but I don't think we spent enough time thinking about is just how much money this costs. So
Yeah.
obviously, Allison Riggs wins in the end, right? She is now sworn in. It's official. It's over finally. But there was a whole lot of money that was spent on not just one lawsuit, but multiple lawsuits from multiple angles. The Democratic Party was already ramping up for this curing process that the state judiciary had put in. And so this was not a costless exercise for the Democratic Party. And so, are they ready for it again? They have to be. Is that a real hit for the party? Yeah, I think it really is.
Now, something I was kind of curious about. So, and I swear I'll get back to this in a second. It'll come around. So, I majored in political science at App State.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and one of the things about going through that process, and also just in the work I've done since then, one thing that I really started to learn about and pay attention to is kind of like our system as a whole of democracy and whatnot, but also the kind of cracks, kind of the weaknesses in the foundation of it. And at least in my opinion, I think this whole thing with Jefferson Griffin really kind of found those cracks, really kind of exploited them. And I was just kind of curious if you, in your professional opinion, if you think what he did over the past 6 months has kind of weakened our democracy, has kind of maybe opened the door to further attacks, so to say, what your thoughts were.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I don't think anybody, left, right, center, came out of this thing thinking they feel better about our election system, right? I don't think that's a one thing that anybody in this state shares. So yeah, I am very worried about what this is doing for trust in the judiciary, trust in our election system in general. Somewhere back on that shelf behind me, I've got a book that sort of goes through the history of all of these different challenges, post-election challenges. And there's none of them in that book that go quite as long as the one that we just experienced. So yeah, I think we are in a new territory. I do not think this is the last time we're going to be having this conversation, not just as a state, but as a country, right? Because ultimately, Jefferson Griffin lost. But how much did he really lose, right? I mean, they lost some money, there was some time, but at the end of the day, if somebody was willing to finance a similar operation in the future, kind of why wouldn't they? And that is the part that scares me. And that scares me if it's somebody from the Democratic Party taking that lesson or the Republican Party taking that lesson. Like, I want to live in a world where once we go through the normal process, it doesn't have to end on election night. Obviously, this is a close election. We're supposed to do recounts. All that was cool. But it really worries me that the lesson may be, hey, you might as well press it. The worst thing that's going to happen is you lose. You lost in the first place.
And do you think that could carry over to like the national scene, like maybe even in this Senate election that's coming up?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's very possible that it carries over to the national scene. I think it's going to be a little tougher to make some of these legal arguments for a federal election, right? I mean, if you think about Jefferson Griffin's case, a lot of it was based on, let's take the UACAPA piece, right? These are the uniformed and military folks overseas. Jefferson Griffin says, hey, look, we have, just to grab one part of his argument, we have a voter ID law in the state of North Carolina, and you can't just not have that because you're a UACAPA voter. And some folks came and said, well, UACAPA is a federal law. Like, this is what's allowed. It's in all the states. And Griffin's response was essentially with a lot of legalese, but he says, look, I ain't running for federal office. I'm running for state office, right? And so therefore the state constitution, the state laws should be the ones that apply. So I think it's going to be tougher to make that case. Not that it's impossible, not that no one will try. That's a tougher case to make, I think, at the federal level than it is for these state elections.
Yeah. And speaking of the federal level, also in 2026, we have a big Senate race coming up in this state, which I'm sure you are going to be paying a lot of attention to. But the question that I have is, how does the Democratic Party both reconcile with the fact that they haven't elected a U.S. Senator since 2008, before a huge realignment in the state, and also the fact that they might still continue to vote Democratic for both AG and for the governor?
Yeah, that's right. AG, governor, I mean, all down the ticket, right? We got 5 council of state offices that are currently held by Democrats. I mean, I think it really is a matter of candidate quality. I mean, yes, the Democrats have not won a Senate election since 2008. That's a fact. There's no question.
Yeah.
Fair and square. Those were the rules. But those have been some pretty close elections. I actually did a little bit of analysis about like which states have the closest Senate elections, and North Carolina is among the closest in the country. So I think if we look at margins, I think the Democratic Party does have a chance. This is going to be a good year to be a Democrat. That doesn't mean that I think that every Democratic position's right. It's just the party, the president, of course, always loses seats during their midterm.
Right.
So we expect the Democrats to do well. I think if the Democrats put forward the right candidate, I think that there's a chance that they can take out Tom Tillis. It's nowhere near a guarantee, but it's possible. What they need though is to figure out who their candidate is. And right now, obviously, Wiley Nickel is declared.
Mm-hmm.
We're all waiting on Roy Cooper, right? I mean, the biggest lie told in North Carolina politics today, I think, is I know what Roy Cooper is going to do. Like, I'm convinced no one actually knows. What's your name? Is Kristen Cooper or Roy Cooper or maybe Morgan Jackson? I don't think you actually know what's going to happen here, but everybody likes to pretend like they know. Once we know what Roy Cooper does, no relation, then I think we're going to have a lot better sense of the seat.
And if that happens,
I'm glad you said no relation. I'm curious.
we batted back and forth of whether to ask that question.
Jeff Tabir used to always introduce me as Chris No Relation Cooper. So
a little bit of a follow-up question on that, and then CJ, I'll let you get to yours. But because we're still kind of waiting on the fence of whether Roy Cooper may or may not announce, I mean, it's been buzzing really since 2024, maybe even before that. Just in smaller circles. But if he declares, do you think that this is something that perhaps the Republican Party needs to look at running a potentially different candidate than Tom Tillis, or do you think that he's still a decent candidate running this third time around?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think Tom Tillis is a good candidate. I don't think that the Republican Party is going to put up a primary challenge to him. So I wrote a little piece in the Assembly titled something like why Tom Tillis doesn't need to worry about a primary. I mean, the reality is sometimes U.S. House members lose primaries. It happens. They get primaried. U.S. senators almost never lose a primary. I mean, it is incredibly rare. We haven't seen one in about 10 years. When they happen, they tend to happen because of scandal. Tom Tillis doesn't have any scandals, right? You may like his policies, you may not like his policies. The folks on the right think he doesn't go far enough right. The folks on the left think he's with Trump too much. But there's no major scandal there, at least thus far. So I think Tom Tillis is the candidate for the Republican Party. And frankly, I think he's a good candidate for the Republican Party for all of those reasons. Now, whether it's enough to beat a Roy Cooper or whoever else the Democrats put up, we'll see. But he can raise money. He's mostly scandal-free, which is hard to say these days. He does have some crossover appeal because from time to time, he is willing to challenge Donald Trump. Yes, it frustrates folks that he doesn't do it more on the left, that he does it too much on the right. But I think he's the right candidate. And if we get Cooper versus Tillis, this is going to be like Helms Hunt territory. This is going to be the kind of race that people are talking about 2 decades from now.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. So kind of bringing it to a little bit down ballot then in 26. We're going to have a bunch of General Assembly seats kind of up for grabs and everything. Are there any particular areas you're kind of watching or anything like that you think are going to be really interesting?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, the vast majority of these seats, as y'all know, are kind of locked in. You can blame redistrict, you can blame gerrymandering, you can blame residential settlement patterns, as people like to say, but just put that aside for a second and I'll start from the idea that most of these seats are locked in. But there's a small number that are going to matter. It's going to be mostly the same ones that really were tight last time. Lindsey Prather's seat in Buncombe County is obviously one watched. The Republicans put up Ruth Smith last time. She raised a fair bit of money. Ultimately, Lindsey Prather was one of, I believe, only 2 members of the Democratic side who was actually able to win in a Trump-favored district. So I think she's absolutely one to watch. That Terrence Everett seat obviously was close last time. I expect to be close again. Tricia Cotham's seat seems like it's probably moving farther left. That one, the Republicans were able to hold on. They put a ton of money into it. I expect to see a ton of money again. I think that one may finally get out of the Republicans' hands this next time. We'll see. But that's one to watch. And then I think there's some primaries to watch too. Like, I am very curious to see what happens, for example, with Cecil Brockman. The Democrats have made no secret about the fact that they're not wild about some of his voting patterns and the times where he takes a walk. He has made it pretty clear that he's not real fond of the Democratic Party establishment right now at this time. We've seen this happen before where the Democratic Party has tried to take out some folks who they didn't believe were sufficiently aligned with the party. So I'm really curious to see what that looks like as well, right? That is a seat that's going to be held by the Democrats. The question I have is which Democrat tends to hold it.
Right. And that one was pretty close the last time around in his primary. He only won by, what did we say it was, CJ? 85 votes?
80 votes or something like that, yeah.
So it's not exactly safe for him necessarily.
No, not in the primary at all. If he makes it through the primary, I'd be shocked if he lost the general given that district. But no, I think none of this is guaranteed for Brockman at this point, or, this small group of folks who tend to run counter to what the minority party, the Democratic Party, wants them to do. So, yeah, Roy Cooper obviously played hardball. It seems like with some of these Democrats in the past, I'm not sure what Stein's appetite is going to be to play hardball like that. I think we'll see. Stein, in general, seems to be playing a little bit of a kind of a kinder role, it seems like, at least publicly, than Cooper. I have no idea whether that's going to translate to backroom dealings or not.
Now, with some of these primaries that we saw, so again, Cecil Brockman's victory by only like 80-something votes. Up in the 27th district, Rodney Pierce being out Michael Ray by like 37 votes, I think. Even over in like Nash County, it wasn't nearly as close, but it was like 400 votes with Chester and Wilkins. What do you think these like kind of really tight margins are saying about the electorate and kind of their mentality, and where do you think maybe the parties need to kind of go from there?
Yeah, I mean, it's wild, right? I mean, just to sort of stop and jump back for a second. I mean, those are incredibly close primary races, and let's keep in mind too, this is in a presidential year where they were that close, right? So we got really high voter turnout, second highest voter turnout in the last 100 years in the state of North Carolina, and you still have a handful of districts in the primary, and then again at the general, that are decided by fewer than 100 votes. I mean, it's bananas, right? So I think what this says is that the primary battle a lot is which ballot do the unaffiliated folks choose, right? I mean, ultimately, that's what the deciding factor is going to be. And the unaffiliated thing's it's a fascinating deal, right? So when you talk to political consultants, when I talk to consultants, they tend to say, it's kind of much ado about nothing. Most of these people, we have other metrics on them. We know which way they lean, right? Just because you're unaffiliated doesn't mean you're a moderate.
It's a bold
but
statement.
Some of the research that I've done, it is a bold statement, right? And I think we see a remarkable amount of movement. So I just track, like, all right, let's grab all these unaffiliated folks that vote consistently. How often do they choose the same primary? I did some of this work with Michael Bitzer. And what we found was just slightly less than half actually changed their primaries. I mean, that has the ability to change the dynamic really, really quickly. So I live out in Jackson County. I live up in the mountains, and I'm in the 11th Congressional District. And there's this guy y'all have heard of, Madison Cawthorn, maybe. Anyway, so when he ran, of course, for in the Republican primary for the 11th Congressional District, there was a big movement, very controversial around here, to get unaffiliated folks, to get Democrats to switch to unaffiliated, and then to get those unaffiliated folks to vote for anybody but Cawthorn. And it kind of worked, right? Cawthorn lost the primary for a variety of reasons I'm happy to talk about. But the key thing to bring it back to our conversation is that group of unaffiliated folks in which primary they chose had a huge amount of power on ultimately who the candidate was. And so I think the parties haven't quite figured out how to work those unaffiliated voters in a primary scenario.
That's super interesting too, because like CJ and I both ran races this last go around in the NC State House. And I think we can say, in different microcosms, I suppose, that, yeah, indeed, the unaffiliated, like you cannot guarantee that it's going to go one way or another. You really have to get down into the data to figure out even an inkling of an idea of how these folks are going to swing. So that's really interesting. And it kind of leads me into, in your view, if you had to predict in the next 10 years, let's say, seems 10 to 15 years, because like 15 years ago, Democrats were holding the North Carolina General Assembly, the governorship, and all that. Obviously, that's not the same today. So 15 years from now, if you had to predict, do you think North Carolina is turning redder, bluer, or like grayer, unaffiliated?
Yeah, I think it's going to continue to be pretty purple, pretty gray, whichever sort of metaphor you want to choose, right? So
Yeah.
the way I sort of think about the last 30 years in North Carolina, it's, I mean, think about a clock, right? And if you've got 12 o'clock, you've got the Democratic Party, and 6 o'clock, you got the Republican Party, right? So strong blue, strong red. The whole South was at like 12 o'clock, right? And then it went eventually to 6. And a couple of states came back to 3:30, right? States like Virginia, for example. North Carolina's weird because we're like at 2:30 or so for the better part of 30 years. Like we were never as democratic as all these other southern states were, and we're not as Republican now. And so I see a lot of Democrats saying, hey, it's eventually we're going to win, right? Eventually the browning of the state, all the in-migrants, the Democratic Party is going to end up dominating. What I tend to see is, yeah, it may get a little bit more Democratic, but I think it's going to be competitive for the foreseeable future. Part of the reason is we're just more rural than the rest of the country. Like we have the second most rural voters in the entire country. Yeah. Texas is the only state that has more. And so, yeah, Charlotte's growing. Yeah, Wake County's growing. Yeah, Buncombe's growing and New Hanover to some degree. But we still have that rural vote that keeps us a little bit redder than you might otherwise expect, given all the growth that's coming in.
And in your suggestions at the conclusion of Anatomy of a Purple State, you put forward some reforms that you feel are actionable to improve North Carolina politics. It kind of seems like just as a whole, if not just in the General Assembly. Which of these do you feel is the most like achievable in the next few sessions, if any at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a few of them are somewhat achievable. So one that I think is pretty achievable, that actually we're seeing some movement on, coupled with something I don't like that I'll talk about. But we are seeing, so one thing I say is that I think we should get rid of these odd year elections, right? So we're about to have a ton of them across the state of North Carolina. Still trying to figure out exactly how many voters are going to be affected totally. Stay tuned. But there's a lot of them, right? So I live in town of Silva. We're going to have a Silva Town Council election. Those things get terrible, terrible, terrible turnout. And they cost money, right? Elections are not free.
Right.
And so one thing I think we can do is move those to even year cycles. The General Assembly is starting to do that. And I actually think it's a really good thing. What I don't love as much is that they tend to be coupling that with moving many of these local elections to partisan affairs from nonpartisan affairs. So they're grabbing, Jackson County actually just did this. There's a bill in the General Assembly to take all local elections in Jackson County, move them to on-year cycles, I'm pro, and slap a partisan label on them, I'm con. So I think we are seeing some movement there. It's coming with something I wish that wasn't there.
Is that something you're willing to bite the bullet on a little bit? If it comes to it, like is that a sacrifice you'll make?
I would rather. It's a great question. No is the short answer, right? So I think these moving these elections to partisan affairs. Maybe just step back to like big institution for a second. Y'all are steeped in this stuff, but if any of your listeners aren't, which I find hard to believe if you're listening, but if you're not, right? So our governor gets the veto power over a lot of stuff. That's a great story. I talk about it in some of the book. But one thing the governor doesn't have the veto power, well, three things: redistricting, constitutional amendments, and what are called local bills. And when I give this talk to like community groups, when I say local bills, everybody takes a nap. But this is really important, right? What this means is if you want to pass a bill into law, and you don't want it to go to the governor's desk, just have it affect a small geography. So if you are say the Republican Party, and you want to stack the farm team more in your favor, and you know there's more Republican counties than Democratic counties, and you know if this goes to the governor's desk, it's going to draw all sorts of media attention, the governor is going to veto it. How do you slow play this? You pass a local bill here and a local bill there and a local bill in another place, and you can slowly remake the state of North Carolina without anybody even really paying attention. And so I don't love the way this is happening. We've had a number of counties who have actually come in and said, please, 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 we're good Republicans. We love you guys, but we don't really think we should have partisan elections and the General Assembly. In some of these cases has listened, and in some of these cases has not. So I don't love the marriage of those two things together. I wish we could separate them out and just go with the cost saving, go with the higher turnout, go with what I think is better for democracy, which is more people involved in elections.
Now, I'm going to take that last little part of more people being involved in elections and kind of spin it in a way. So, with the General Assembly, one thing that I've kind of noticed and just looking around, kind of reading up on the folks who are in there, is a lot of them come from, say, wealthier backgrounds. They're not necessarily working class. A lot of them are lawyers or doctors, real estate agents, whatever. And so that allows them to kind of get in the door, right? Because for those who don't know, who are listening to this, right now the salary for a member of the state house is
$951.
$951, yeah. We got the book right here. But $13,951, obviously that is a barrier to a lot of folks who can't get involved with the politics. See, brought it around.
Yep.
What do you think the odds actually are of, the NCGA kind of raising the salary and kind of maybe reworking, say, the long session, the short session and whatnot to make it maybe more of a full-time sort of thing?
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you brought that up, right? And that's another reform that I believe in strongly. So we have a couple things on the front end. We have, obviously, it's a big state, it's a growing state. We give the vast majority of our power to the legislature. We're a legislature first state. States vary in this. We say, legislature, y'all in charge of most things. We can argue about whether that's good or bad, but that's a fact. And then we pay them $13,951 a year. We are in session longer in the long session than the short session usually, but sometimes that's not even true, and we don't put any sort of session length on it. And we don't give folks a lot of staff, unfortunately, right? So that's what political scientists call lack of professionalism. And so what are the odds of changing that? I mean, I think there are some ways, but I think it needs two things. One, it needs a lot of public information. So I did a survey experiment I'll talk about a little bit in the book, where I asked people, like, how much money do you think members of the General Assembly make? And I do it in 4 states: California, North Carolina, of course, New Hampshire, and there's a 4th state I forgot that I surveyed. And I asked people, the bottom line is everybody thinks politicians make tons of money. And the reality is, of course, they don't. So then I corrected the information for some people, for half the sample. So for half of them in North Carolina, I said, actually, they make $13,951. And then I asked folks, do you think we should increase that salary or not? Turns out, this isn't rocket science. If you tell people how poor the salary is, they're more okay with raising it. So if you just, if I walk out from campus, my office today, and grab somebody and say, should we give state legislators a raise? Heck no. Can I say hell on here?
Yeah,
please. I hope so.
You can say a lot worse. I promise you that.
I won't go any worse than that. But if I say, hey, folks that represent you make less than $14,000 a year, now what do you think? I think, we know that person's probably going to say yes. So I think thing one, education. Thing two, we need is to make sure it does not apply to the current session. Nobody wants to see people giving themselves a raise. So it has to apply for the future. And I think California actually has a model, which is going to be sort of kryptonite for some folks that I said California. But California has a model where they have a commission. Basically, they say, look, legislators should be deciding their own salaries. That's silly. Let's have a commission that decides what's a reasonable salary based on cost of living, based on what inflation is, based on all these other factors. I think that's something with the right education that could maybe gain some traction. But if it is just, some random member of the General Assembly introduces a bill to raise the salary, which has happened that's dead on arrival. It's got to be a bigger campaign than that.
Wow. Quick follow-up question on that. Do you know if these independent commissions, are they like citizens, or are they people that are involved directly with parties and everything like that, or who is it usually made up of?
They tend to be made up of citizens, but the devil is in the details.
Yeah.
And how do those citizens get on there? They do tend to be appointed by the parties. But I think this is one where hopefully can be some bipartisan agreement, right? There's no reason I can think of to think that a Democrat or a Republican should have different opinions on how much legislators get paid. It seems like we should be able to look at a market together and say, hey, look, I'm a Republican and I want them to make as much money as possible, but not too much. I want to get the right kind of person in office. I'm a Democrat and I want that. It feels like that's maybe a rare place where we might actually be able to get some bipartisan agreement.
Well, I sure hope so. At some point, I don't want our legislators barely living off of a livable wage, or a non-livable wage, so to speak.
It's crazy, right? And we can get off this onto something else, but just to think about it for a second, we've got a situation where we're paying people's staff more money than we're paying the legislator. And I'm all for staff making money too, by the way. But what we see is members of both parties often will have, and y'all know this, their spouses as their legislative assistant. Men, women both do it. Republicans do it. Democrats do it. Why? Because that's the only way to make this thing work for a household. That's insane.
Yeah.
Right? That this is the lengths that people are going to. Not that spouses can't be good aides. I don't mean that at all. But there shouldn't be the incentive for that to be the system. So in the book, Lindsay Prather gave me kind of a great example. She lives in Buncombe County, and talking to her about this whole issue of salary and session length and all this, and she says it much better than I'm going to say it now. But essentially, she said, "Look, I'm lucky. I'm meaning Lindsay Prather, Representative Prather. I'm lucky. I have family who lives in the Triangle. I have a job that's pretty flexible. I have a spouse who's pretty flexible." And she says, we shouldn't have to depend on that to get people to run for office. And I totally agree. And I think that's true whether you're Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated, Green, Libertarian, We the People, if there's still a party this week, whatever you happen to be a member of.
So, sorry, the We the People thing made me laugh.
Yeah, that got me.
Yeah, good.
So, oh my God!
Do we need to take a breather?
Yeah. So I was gonna say, I think one of the things other than pay that does stand out is just a lot of folks, they can't get into this because aside from pay, they don't have jobs that are flexible, like you mentioned. I mean, like I said, a lot of the folks in their doctors, their lawyers, they have their own practices. They can take a break, but say I wanted to go and run and get elected, I'd have to go find a job that was willing to let me take a sabbatical for 6 months at a time, or let me essentially make my own schedule, but not a lot of clarity on what said schedule would be like.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And so I live a little more than 4 hours from Raleigh, and so the problem is even greater the farther you get from the state capital, right? I mean, if you live in Raleigh, it'd be a pain, but you go home and get a tuna fish sandwich for lunch if you needed to. If you're Kevin Corbin and you live in Franklin, North Carolina, and it's a full 5 hours to Raleigh, you can't do that. So the effects of this are not consistent across place. It also means that we're going to get fewer and fewer young people in office, which, look at our General Assembly or Congress, everybody says there's way too much gray hair there. Well, this kind of thing only makes it worse. We also know that in these relatively unprofessional legislatures like ours tend to get fewer women in office, right? So the effects of this are really huge. And the unpredictable session length, Jim Perry, who is a former Republican senator, of course, talked to for the book. And, he was saying, look, we need to put some guardrails on session length as well, right? So I had Prather talking a bit about the salary piece, Jim Perry talking a bit about the session length piece. And I'll say one thing that I hope Democrats and Republicans can agree on in the General Assembly this cycle is that Justin Hall, you may love what he's doing or not love what he's doing as far as policy or ideology, but I like that the man has a calendar. And he's putting it out. We'll see whether he follows it after June 30th, but at least up until this point, there's at least a little more of a calendar, which kudos to him. And how is it 2025 and we're giving somebody kudos for a calendar? Like, it's bananas that this is the first time this has come up. And that just, how does that feel if you are thinking about running for office? It's just mind blowing. Right? I got 2 kids at home. Luckily for all of y'all in the state of North Carolina, I ain't running for office ever. But if I did, like, how would I explain this to my family?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to commute sometimes, but not others. My spouse is going to have to be in charge of the kids sometimes, but not others. And I can't quite plan for it. It's not a good way to run a state.
Yeah, I can definitely also say for certain that anybody outside of this state or even in it has a hard time just navigating even the first thing about North Carolina politics. Forget the General Assembly. Like, just following it on TV, you got to read a whole book, which is why we're so glad that one exists. Highly encourage anybody to pick up Anatomy of a Purple State. I personally listened to the audiobook version on my way to and from picking up my daughter, which that was a nice listen. So thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for giving us your insights and also giving us a little bit of, like, and I'm not trying to spoil your book, but we talked a lot about some of the things that you talk about in the book. And that's why I highly encourage anybody to still pick it up, because he goes into a lot more detail with some of this stuff. A lot of it, and it's pretty digestible, even if you're not a numbers person. And can I just say personally, we're both political science majors, CJ and I. I really wish I could have taken your class.
Thanks. It's been great talking to both of y'all. Appreciate what you're doing and trying to put this information out there. So thanks for your interest and thanks for doing what you do and being comfortable laughing about it sometimes too. That's the fun part.
You have to. You have to at some point. It can't all be serious all the time. But speaking of not keeping it serious all the time. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, sometimes you got to laugh to stop from crying.
Right.
That's right.
Speaking of keeping it not serious, last question that we have for you. What is your go-to cookout menu order, if you even have one?
So I was there yesterday actually with my kids. So it's not like super exciting. It's just a double cheeseburger tray with a vanilla milkshake. I realize that's really boring. Like, that's not fun. That's not cool.
Nice. Do you ever get wild with it a little bit? Do you ever put anything on there that?
Yeah, sometimes. But I don't know. That I decided to go with the last one. I could pretend, I could dress it up, I could pretend like yesterday I got something interesting. I didn't. It was a boring day yesterday.
Well, sometimes we get to have boring days. Sometimes we get to have boring days in between the normal ones, or in between the extraordinary ones. But yeah, thank you so much. Professor Chris Cooper, again, wrote Anatomy of a Purple State, which is out in stores and on audiobook if you want to check that out. Where can people see more of you?
Yeah. I, for good or ill, and it's both, stay up on social media stuff. So I'm still on Twitter, X, whatever it's called this week. I'm also on Blue Sky. Sometimes post stuff to Threads, all the fair warnings. It's less political there. I tend to post more random music stuff, but I'm on most of those things. I blog sometimes at Old North State Politics with my friend Michael Bitzer. I write for the Assembly every now and again. I think I may have a new piece coming out there fairly soon, and got a website which is chriscooper.com. Not that I'm selling anything, so find things there as well.
Well, except for the book.
Except for the book. That's a good point. I guess I am selling them. That's right.
Yeah, no, just thank you for taking the time to up on here and talk to us about the book, about just kind of the state of, well, I guess the state.
Thank you, and you're welcome back on anytime. If perhaps maybe 2026 rolls around, we can revisit and see where everything fell.
I'd love to. Yeah, no, anytime. It's great to talk to both of y'all. I'm actually gonna be. Joe Stewart's got me doing some talk in the General Assembly building in a couple of weeks too, if y'all are around.
Oh wow. Okay.
It's like in the morning. It's like 7:30 in the morning or something ridiculous. So like, get jacked up on coffee. But if you're around, love to see you both.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great.